Hello, everyone. I'm Rich Levy, the great class of 1974. I'm president of it for a little bit longer, so this is part of my swan song. But a big welcome. A big welcome to my classmates and to all other EIFs who are here in the audience this afternoon. Some quick housekeeping. Please look around and note where the exits are, and just like on an airplane, some of them may be behind where you are seated. Please silence your phones and devices, but photography is permitted. Smoking, food, and beverages are not permitted in the auditorium, and there should be no dancing in the aisles, except to music selected by the class of 1974, as will be the case on Saturday morning at the annual meeting of the Society of Alumni. But do feel free to perform your best anti-rain dances. On behalf of the class of 1974, I'm pleased to welcome all EIFs of all ages back to Williams for Reunion Weekend 2024 and to a series of 3 reunion seminars hosted by our class. Where's page 2? There it is. Before we move to the main event, I'd like everyone to note that 80 years and just about 8 hours ago on this day, June 6, 1944, the greatest generation of civilian soldiers from the United States, England, Canada, and France landed at Normandy, France, and embarked on the campaigns that would spell the final end of the Second World War in Europe. We thank all of them, and especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice so that our freedoms would endure. I want to thank the members of the class of 1974 Reunion Speaker Committee, co-chairs Ken Kessel and Margie French, and members Michelle Leibovitz Lamar, Jonathan Kravitz, and Chris Corson, for their work in selecting the 3 representatives of our class who you will see and hear in 2 programs this afternoon and 1 tomorrow. For these programs, our committee selected 3 well-regarded members of our class whose lives and careers make us proud to be their classmates and to share the common root of a Williams education. Contrary to any popular misconceptions, these 3 presenters are very interesting, very smart, and very articulate. But let's face it, what else would you expect from Williams alumni at a reunion weekend program? One is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, a renowned university teacher and scholar of American history, law, and science. One took his experiences as an actor, director, and president of Williams' own Cap and Bells to a successful career in advertising, and later to service as a respected leader of regional not-for-profit theater companies here in Williamstown and in Key West, Florida. And the third, from whom you will hear tomorrow, joined our class in 1971 as one of the pioneering generation of women transfer students. She is a respected international advocate for the promotion of women's reproductive health and the combating of international trafficking of women. As they will share, Williams played a key role in forging their powers and skills of analysis, communication, comprehension, reasoning, and action. I, for one, am honored just to be a plain old audience member as they speak to us in these programs. I hope you'll be here for all 3 sessions, 2 today and 1 tomorrow. So let's begin. The introduction of our first reunion seminar today presents a unique opportunity for me. I can't say that I have ever before been in the presence of 2 personal acquaintances of mine, both of whom have Pulitzer Prize-related credentials, and with each of them not only having Williams degrees, but actually having set foot in the very Williamstown house that my wife and I now own, albeit long before we purchased it in 2015. Paul Neely was the prior owner of the house, and Ed Larson was his guest on several occasions. So as to get to the heart of this event, instead of using up their time by recounting their impressive credentials, I commend to you their amazing resumes. Let me say simply that Ed's career includes experience as a lawyer, teacher, and prolific author, punctuated by a long run as professor of history at the University of Georgia for 20 years, and currently as a university chairholder at Pepperdine University, where he teaches in the history department and in the School of Law. A capstone of his career was the Pulitzer Prize in History for his 1997 book, which will be the focal point of today's session, Summer for the Gods, The Scopes Trial and America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion. Paul Neely, a member of the class of 1968, is billed as the inquisitor for today's program. Don't worry, Ed. To borrow from Monty Python's Flying Circus, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Paul spent his professional life in the field of journalism, from reporting, for which in 1973 he and a colleague on the Riverside, California Free Press were Pulitzer Prize finalists in local reporting. He moved to managing editor and later publisher of the Chattanooga Times. And Paul should be well known to this audience for his distinguished service on the Board of Trustees of our college. After their conversation, Ed and Paul will open the floor to questions from the audience. For a revisiting of the 1925 Scopes trial and how its lessons fit into the current era, please welcome Ed Larson and Paul Neely.
Thank you. It's always good to be before an audience of younger people, which leads, including we are honored to have the presence of the president of Williams College today and her husband, Steve Simon. I think you'll get to know them better over the weekend. They are wonderful people. So you may wonder why in the world they had to draft a guy from the class of '68 to do this job. In the late 90s, when Ed's book, and it's available at Amazon and bookstores near you, when it came out, he, I guess, went on some sort of book tour, including speaking at the Chattanooga, Tennessee Rotary Club. I live in Chattanooga. I was still with the newspaper at that time. So I went to hear him, and the introducer said, our speaker today graduated from Williams College. Well, that's not a sentence you hear very often in Chattanooga. So I went up and met him, and we've had numerous sessions together since then, always to my benefit. He is a polymath, as we'll get into, and some of it goes back, and some of it he continues to open up topics. This book about the Scopes trial, I should add also, the other reason I got interested in this topic in the first place, my house in Chattanooga is about 20 miles from where the Scopes trial took place. So it's always been kind of a shadow there. That obviously combines Ed's two interests in history and the law. So I thought we might start at a Williams place. How did you cover those topics and science during your days at Williams? Were there any special faculty that played a significant role for you? Part of what you do at 50th reunions is take trips down memory lane. So we ought to mention those people.
Well, thank you. It has been an honor. This guy is amazing, and what he means to Chattanooga. When I went up there, he was, you just told me that you went back there recently and somebody said you used to be somebody. Yeah. And I think that he really is a force to be reckoned with. And the Chattanooga Times was an incredibly important paper. It was, of course, as you may know, it was the owner of the New York Times, or there's some sort of, it was
Adolph Fox started in Chattanooga, and 18 years later went and bought the New York Times.
Yeah, so,
So I was the first person to be publisher outside that family.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, they wound up selling the paper then.
And I did want to say that the thing that struck me as I was sitting up there looking over the class, I remember you guys look, and it's mostly guys from our class, look so much younger than when I was here 50 years ago and looked at the 50-year-old reunion class. They looked ancient, and you guys look great. So, yeah, of course Williams shaped us all. I came from, a small public high school in a rural area, and Williams was a transforming experience, but a lot of professors made an enormous difference. You ask about the book in particular, but before I narrow it down to the book, some of my history professors, including Oakley, Francis Oakley, and Dudley Ballman was very inspirational history professor for me. Jim Burns became something of a mentor throughout my career. But oddly enough, for the book, this is sort of a strange one, but I took, I'm trying to think of his name right now. He ended up going to, his father was a famous historian, and he was here, and then he went to, somebody can remind me of his name, he went to William Mystic.
Labrie.
Labrie, yeah, Labrie. And Labrie told me, I was sort of curious, and because I think he only brought out, he may have brought out a book later, but at that time he'd only brought out his dissertation. And it was a book about the Boston Tea Party. And his father was like a world-class famous historian, I think at Harvard or Yale. And I asked him why he ever wrote a book about the Boston Tea Party. And he said, well, his father suggested it for his dissertation because it was an event that every American knew about, but no historian had ever written a book about. And therefore, you could write a book, no historian had ever written a book. So it was part of our common knowledge, but anything that's in our common knowledge tends to be mythologized. We don't have a very accurate perception. We just have the myths and the stories. So it was a legendary event, but people didn't really understand it. So he wrote at his father's suggestion, wrote that book. And then it became the definitive work, since there wasn't any other. It's not like writing on George Washington. There are a lot of books already there. So it basically made his name. And if you got, back then at least, if you looked at any, and this was true even when I was teaching later, if you looked at any textbook, what they like to do in textbooks, authors like to get at end of every chapter for further reading. And they list a bunch of books for further reading. And the real goal in doing that is to get the people whose book is listed there to assign the book, because it gives them credibility. It's a scam in the textbook industry. And I would always check, and Labrie's book was always listed in that chapter as the book on the Boston Tea Party. So when and I had written my dissertation on the creation evolution legal controversy, and I had discovered in the process of that the Scopes trial was nothing like Inherit the Wind. It was nothing at all like the legend of the Scopes trial. And so it struck me when somebody suggested, because it combined my science work and my history work and my law work, I thought this would be a Labrie sort of project that I knew no historian had ever written a book about the Scopes trial, ever. But everyone had heard about it. It's amazing. I can go into a high school or a college giving a lecture, or even people I don't know, and you ask like 18-year-olds, have you heard of the Scopes trial? And they've all heard of it. I mean, what other event have our students who watch, those students who watch nothing but TikTok have heard about? Yet they have heard of the Scopes trial. They couldn't name any other trial, but they can name that one. And so, and I knew where the archival material was and everything. It had only been 2 pages in my original book, but I discovered it was a topic. So I ended up, I was taking a year off because my wife was pregnant and I was going to watch the baby after the baby came. And so I gathered up all the materials and I wrote it. But that one experience, I wouldn't have done it but for Labrie telling me about this trick that worked for him of the Boston Tea Party. And the same trick worked for me because it became a bestseller, and as this guy got the Pulitzer Prize. And the trick was that everybody'd heard of the Scopes trial, but when they read the real story, it was even better than Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence's Inherit the Wind. And Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence both told me that.
You know, in a slight wrinkle on that, you have degrees in both law and history. Where did the science enter in? Because that's not a typical combination.
Well, my PhD is actually the history of science, not history. And history of science departments back then, they're mostly gone now, but back then, history of science departments, as our tiny one here at Williams, were part of the science departments. And they were funded, like my grad school work was all funded by the National Science Foundation. History of science was big back starting in the 50s. To try to understand science because science was becoming so powerful. And that was my interest, honestly. I thought that science back then, different era, 50 years ago, had incredible authority, much less now. But back then it had a lot of authority. And I was interested in epistemology and I was interested in sources of authority. And I had studied the medieval period with Frank Oakley, and Frank Oakley back then, religion had authority, and Frank Oakley was very sensitive to the type of authority religion had. Well, I thought, silly person that I am, but starting in the 50s, after World War II, after the Greatest Generation, science had that particular authority in our country. And so I was interested in that the same way Frank Oakley was interested in religion. And I just thought always did history of ideas here. That was history of ideas is what I did. But I did take, I took quite a few, I don't know if any of you ever had Park, physics professor, smartest guy I ever had here. And that includes, that includes quite a few people. But I got fascinated with physics with him. And I took a lot of his classes, 3 of them, I think. And I took what history of science we did have under Don Beaver. And so that's what I decided. And I talked with Bauman and others, and they said, yeah, that's a great field to go into. Jim Burns thought it was a great idea. So for grad school, that was my intent when I left here, to go in to get a PhD in history of science. And I looked around and I asked, where were the places to go? And they said, well, you have 2 choices, Harvard or Wisconsin. You'll never get a job if you go to Harvard because nobody will hire you, except elite schools, and you'll have a better chance with a broader range. So go to Wisconsin. And so that's where I went.
So a lot of your books touch on 2 or 3 of those areas. Polar exploration, eugenics. But then you've got a book on George Washington, on the first election in 1800, the first real election in 1800, Benjamin Franklin. Those topics don't fit neatly in there. So how'd you get interested in that period of American history? And more broadly, how does a historian, as you go through your career, decide, okay, where do I go next? What topic interests me? Where do I want to even begin the research, let alone write?
College tuition costs. There's the short answer. My kids were getting ready to go to college. And the nice thing about winning a Pulitzer Prize is you don't need an agent. You can call any book company and you can pitch an idea. And I got called by one of them, an editor, a really good editor from, is that Random House? I think it was Random House. No, or I tend to hop around and publishers. But they said...
To the highest bidder.
Well, back then. So the question came, can you write another book like the Scopes book? And I said, sure. But what do you mean by a book like the Scopes book? Because, these editors, they live in the world themselves, and he clearly had an idea what a book like the Scopes book was. I was sitting there thinking, okay, I'm going to write one on Leopold and Loeb, trial or something like that. He said, well, of course, what the Scopes book all about? And I said, what do you think it's about? It's about the battle of science versus religion in American history. I said, oh, that's what you think it's about. That's not what I thought it was about, but that's what he thought it was about. And the only reason it has a title is because I have the framed first cover. It doesn't have that title. It has a different subtitle. They changed the subtitle without asking me, marketing did. to the Science and Religion because they thought
Yeah,
it sell
the
better.
subtitle now says The Scopes Trial, an America's continuing debate over science and religion.
Yeah, and that was not the original title. It literally, I was shocked when I got my first copy and it had that title on it. Shows you what publishers do when you don't have a Pulitzer Prize. Anyway, and they said, well, some vignette, you're good at short subjects, and I think the editor was right. He says, I've read everything you've written. You're good at short subjects where you can take one small item and from that one small episode, tell a big story. As opposed to other people can write a sweeping history, and I write, narrowcast. I'm best when it's a narrow topic, and then I tell a big story with that. So I said, oh, that's what you think it's about. Well, after this book came out, I once taught a graduate seminar at Georgia called Episodes in Science and Religion in America. Let me send you an email, the syllabus. And if there's one that you like, we can negotiate. Because my kid was going to college, and I thought that'd be a good thing. And then I sent it to him, and one of the episodes was Science and Religion in the election of 1800. Because it was an election that in part played on that issue, with Adams being the candidate of religion and Jefferson being attacked as that atheist scientist, Jefferson being the candidate of science. And it really was. It was a major issue in that campaign. We don't think of it that way now because, their actual religious views were almost identical. They were both some sort of providential theists, and they knew that, but that's not the way it was portrayed. So he looked over the list, and we did about 12 different episodes and he looked over the list and says, "That's the one. That would be great." And I said, "Okay, write a whole book about the election of 1800." And it turns out when I did do the research for that book, it turned out that Science and Religion was only one chapter. That there was a lot more to that election. And so I wrote the book on Magnificent Catastrophe that also won some prizes and sold the editor was right. I mean, the book sold many more copies than was ever sold. It made the bestseller list, which Summer for the Gods never did. But there are certain periods of American history, the Civil War and the Revolutionary Era, that sell. And the founders. And so that led me to that book. And so that's how I got there, Science and Religion. And then when I did that book, I sort of got fascinated and ended up with Franklin and Washington. But when you really think about Franklin is a very important scientist. And to really understand him, you need to know science as well. And so there is history of science in that book. And then in the Magnificent Catastrophe. So that's how I ended up.
Like many of us, your career was a twisted path, not what you had necessarily planned exactly at age 22.
Absolutely, I
think
never would have
a lot of
thought
people here can identify with that.
Though I'll have to admit, one Williams time, very short, being connected with Jim Burns helped, because with knowing Jim Burns, he and Susan Dunn had worked on the election of 1800, but they were also Washington. And so the fact that I'd worked on those areas with them, there's a Williams tie there as well.
So let's go back to Summer for the Gods. As you alluded to earlier, it's kind of a corrective version of Inherit the Wind. It is far more complicated. It is, in many ways, less dramatic, more ambiguous, a whole lot of things that make you rethink, if that movie that was supposed to be real life added that much distorted drama, what does every movie do? But more specifically, did you see that distinction right off when you started looking at that topic, or did that evolve in your research?
Well, I loved and still love Inherit the Wind. It's a 3-act originally, now 2-act morality play about tolerance, and which does not fit. That's first thing that's not accurate. Because for their pluses and minuses, and I've written books about Darrow, and I know O'Brien, neither man was tolerant. There wasn't an ounce of tolerance in either man.
Let alone H.L. Mencken's commentary on the side.
There was no tolerance there either. There was no tolerance in that trial. But Inherit the Wind is a morality play about tolerance, but that's how Bob Lawrence and Jerry Lee wanted. In my research, I got to know them, and they ended up loving the book because they always contended that they were not writing about the Scopes trial. They always contended, and if you read the original playbills, this makes this clear. They were using the Scopes trial the exact same way Arthur Miller was using the Crucible and the Salem witchcraft trials. They were a way to attack McCarthyism at its height. And they were using them as straw men. And that's why they twisted it. If you saw it and it was the longest running play in Broadway history at the time. And if you saw it at the time, in the mid-50s, you would immediately see as McCarthyism. It's all twisted to be like McCarthyism. And so that's why, and they ended up loving the book, and it turns out after my book came out, whenever there were openings all over the world, really, of Inherit the Wind, and it still was played, I know, they would always ask me, and I would go with one of them, either Bob Lee or Jerry Lawrence, and do the opening before the play and do the thing for the donors. And so Kansas City or Kansas City Rep or Montreal or wherever. We used to go all over. And it was great fun to be with the two of them. And so I ended up knowing, once I read the real materials, because I love to do archival work, and I'd gone up to your neck of the woods. The archives and the Scopes trial are mostly in Nashville, some in Knoxville, and a few, very few back then, virtually none in Dayton, except there were some survivors. So I interviewed the survivors, people who'd watched the trial. Boy, it was there. You talk about, like you tell a story to tell a story. Their memories were befuddled, but I got to know them. And so I realized it was so different. And so I knew that going in, and I ended up getting great allies in Bob Lee, Jerry Lawrence, and also Tony Randall, who was the last surviving member of the Broadway cast. And he became good friends, and he had me up when he brought a revival of the play at his theater in New York City. And I worked with George C. Scott and Lemon, who were the two actors playing the two parts. In prepping them for him. So, it's a gift that never stopped giving.
And how does an average reader face it? Because an average reader goes in with roughly the same knowledge that they had of the Boston Tea Party. They might have encountered it in a children's book or something. It's actually, in today's New York Times, there's a daily advertisement in the arts section from the TV show Jeopardy. And it gives the Jeopardy clue, and you're supposed to know what the answer is. And today's says something like, in 1925, a Tennessee law outlawed teaching this subject, which was not repealed until 1967. And of course, the answer is supposed to be evolution. So this topic is still around. Jeopardy tonight, it says in the ad. When you encounter average readers, not a distinguished intellectual audience like this, but average readers, what do they say? Are they glad to face more ambiguity, or do they wonder whether the movie was the right version?
No, they don't. I've never gotten any hostility. It doesn't matter. The creationists love it, and the pro-science people. I love that after it won the Pulitzer Prize, it was made a premium. Both the ACLU and Bryan College, that fundamentalist school that grew out of the trial, both used it as a premium. If you gave a certain amount of money, you get a copy of Larson's book.
That's a tribute to the book and you.
Yeah, because they both thought it was accurate. The problem with Inherit the Wind, and I still love it because I believe in tolerance, even though America doesn't have a lot of it anymore. But the play and the movie spoke to the 50s. But we all know that it doesn't end happily. We all know that it doesn't end with Spencer Tracy, as in the movie, or Paul Mooney in the play. At the end, picking up the judge's Bible and picking up the copy of Origin of the Species, weighing them in each hand, like, if you read the script, like the blind justice, the statue, weighing them in both hands and then slapping them together. And that's the phrase, and putting it in the both in the briefcase and walking off to the sounds of Leslie Ugham singing. What did she end with? The Battle Cry of the Republic or something like that. I watched the movie solely to hear Leslie Uggams. We know it doesn't end that way. We know it's a continuing debate. We know that at the time my book came out, Tennessee was passing laws mandating equal time for evolution and creation, and then when that got struck down, their new law, their current law, that mandates teaching critical thinking about evolution. And that one hasn't been struck down because, Bush got a lot more appointments to the court. And so we know it's an ongoing. We know that it did not settle the issue. And therefore, you read my book, and you realize it didn't settle the issue and why. And so for our audience today, I've always encountered this from every side. They find it much more satisfying. I mean, Inherit the Wind is a nice story, but it's when they read, and they might believe it when you get sucked into it. I mean, who can? Spencer Tracy's a darn good actor. But you read the book and you say, oh yeah, that's what's happening.
Yeah, a couple of days ago, the Republican Party in Texas adopted its platform. One plank says that the Bible should be taught in public schools with chaplains on hand to counsel and give guidance from a traditional biblical perspective based on Judeo-Christian principles. So it is still with us, so much still with us that in 2020, you published an afterword to the book. So if you haven't bought the book yet, which I encourage you to do, the latest edition comes with that afterword added to it. So tell us what the gist of that was and why you felt compelled to add on to the original book.
Well, I felt compelled to because my publisher wanted to bring out an anniversary edition, and they wanted an afterward, and they thought it'd sell better with an added afterward. So I was compelled to, because that's what my editors wanted.
This is my second copy. I wanted to read it.
But there was something to add, because by that time, which wasn't true in the first version, you've got Tennessee passing and the court striking down the equal time law. Equal time you have to teach. If you teach evolution, you got to also teach creationism. And that had been struck down, Tennessee's equal time law. And the one that made it to the Supreme Court was Louisiana. But Tennessee, Louisiana, I think Arkansas all passed equal time laws. Well, that had been struck down, and so I could do that. But since that, the so-called Academic Freedom Bill, or whatever it was called, it was passed in several states. I think it was Academic Freedom Law, which requires you have to teach critical thinking and evolution and climate change. It was 4 issues. Climate change, I'm trying to think of the other 2. That had not been struck down. And so that there was more to tell, even in Tennessee. But that was, too, a national phenomenon. But also between intelligent design and this revived under Bush, the second Bush, this revived sort of Christian nationalism. And so it was stronger then than it had been in the 90s, because when I wrote the book, it was still, Clinton was president, and it was ongoing, and I knew it was ongoing, and I presented it as ongoing, but it was much stronger. And so I could tell more stories, but again, I could base them in Dayton. And I could tell stories about what had happened in Dayton, because I'd been back several times. And that town, as the book shows, the original, it was not a fundamentalist town. It was actually challenging the law. It's not like, again, it's not like Inherit Wind. They were actually challenging the law. And it wasn't a hostile prosecution of John Scopes. It was a test case of the statute. But now they have become, they have become the image, how they were presented. If you ever watch the play, it begins with a lynch mob outside the jail, and Scopes is in jail. And there's a lynch mob, and they meant it to be a lynch mob. Of course, the play, there were still lynch mobs in the South, lynching black people in the South in the 50s. It was still happening. And so that was intentional. In the movie, it starts with that small group led by a fundamentalist minister and a newspaper person and 2 police officers marching up to Lajli Ugum singing Give Me That Old Time Religion up to the school and marching in and taking the guy from Bewitched, who played played Scopes. That's why he got the Bewitched role, by the way, because he was known for being Scopes, and they figured, oh, that would work with him being with a witch. Honestly, that was part of it. And so anyway, you learn a lot of little things when you dive very deeply in a very narrow week-long subject. But anyway, that sense that they created, the town became the fiction that Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence created became the reality. The town became, there was no fundamentalist church in town. It wasn't a fundamentalist center. It was, and it never had backed Bryan in an election when he ran for president. And now they became the image that they were presented. So it was an interesting of history following or the fact following fiction.
Yeah, Tennessee has the highest percentage of any state of people who describe themselves as evangelical Protestants.
There you go.
And in the last election, they went for Mr. Trump 82%.
And you used to have such good senators. They were Republican. Howard Baker was one of my heroes when I worked for Congress. I loved him. I worked for the other side in the House, but we all loved Howard Baker. And now you got,
We reverted to yahoos. And you alluded a little bit earlier, just a few minutes ago, on it's not just science and religion, that there are these broad topics. In fact, there was a book published 3 years ago called Minds Wide Shut about those divisions. And it says it's not limited to any one camp. It flourishes across the political spectrum, giving rise to dueling monologues of shouting and abuse between those who are certain that they can't be wrong, that truth and justice are all on their side, and there is nothing to learn from their opponents who must be evil or deluded. Anybody know that book, Minds Wide Shut? Yeah. The co-author was Morton Owen Shapiro, the 16th president of Williams College. He wrote it with one of his Northwestern colleagues 3 years ago. So it's a widely recognized phenomenon. And their book is a lot about developing dialogue and empathy. They don't give very good suggestions to my mind about how you go about doing that, but bringing people together rather than keeping them apart.
Well,
Do you get that reaction when people read still this book and think more broadly?
Great question, because that's exactly why they like the book. Not the story, but that's what the trial did. The trial drove people apart. Now that shouldn't surprise you. That's what trials do. That's the problem with the Anglo-American legal system, is unlike the French system, which tends to draw people together because law is not, an elevated profession and you sort of work together with a judge to reach a result. At least that's how I understand the civil law system. In the Anglo-American system developed in England and carried over to the US, the object is to have lawyers present only their side. So the plaintiff only presents their side and the defendant only presents their side, and the idea is a neutral jury hearing these two clashing presentations of the facts, that the neutral jury can come up with can find the truth that way. And it may, and famously, Lord Coke, I think, described the English legal system as the greatest engine ever designed by the mind of man to divine the truth. To which, but the problem with it is it drives the two parties apart because they're only hearing their side of the story and they get fixed and more and more and more. It makes it very divisive. And so it's why lawyers are so important in America, because they got to tell the story their way. Hence, Will Rogers' famous retort saying, yes, the Anglo-American legal system is the best engine ever designed by the mind of man to determine who has the best lawyer. Very true. And that's why our lawyers get paid so much, because they earn it. But it drives people apart. And that's what the Scopes trial did. Because you had no tolerance on either side, both of them did exactly what Morton was describing. They were both presenting their side, and the newspapers, including your New York Times, and the Chattanooga Times, but also the other Chattanooga paper, the Tennessee newspapers in every town were split, one way versus the other way. They each told their story, so did H.L. Mencken. And the result is Americans were driven apart, a thing that had not been a culture war issue before the trial, became the defining cultural war issue of the next 30 years because of the gifts, the speaking gifts of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, two of the most articulate speakers of their era. And by the way, a little fun fact that could go on Jeopardy, the second and third highest paid people on the Chautauqua lecture circuit at the time. That's how they could pack, either of them could pack Carnegie Hall, and they drove us apart.
Yeah, Adlai Stevenson once famously said that he was cursed by the ability to see both sides of a question. And you don't hear many people saying that these days. So we're going to get to questions in just a minute, particularly about this book, but first, what's next? You're going to go to half-time teaching a year from now, a year and a half from now. They have a little more time to tinker around the edges if you wish, or continue in whatever you consider your mainstream. But you got some plans?
Oh, well,
Everybody at 50th Reunion ought to have plans for the future. Take that to heart.
I do have I'm just getting near the end of a book that's going to come out next fall. Not this fall, next fall, with Norton, which is my current publisher. And it'll be on the 1776. I promise, my last book about the Revolutionary era. I've already written one more than I thought, but it was just too tempting for the 200th and 50th anniversary, a quarter of a millennium from the U.S. So it's on that. And with that, so that's coming out. And I do have some ideas, for instance, but I'm shifting, I already have with some articles that are coming out more into the history of science, and I think I'll just sort of dotter away back in the history of science.
Doddering is also something you think about at the 50th Reunion. Anything else you want to add about Summer for the Gods? Where did the title Summer for the Gods come from?
It was epiphany in the middle of a shower. Do you ever have those? I always have to keep a notepad next to my bed because I wake up in the middle of the night, more often now, having to go to the bathroom, but with an idea in my head, and I need to write it down because if I don't, it's gone by the morning. But in the middle of the show, I was playing with titles, and I think I'm pretty good at titles, not as good as Richard Dawkins, but pretty good with titles. And it hit me in a flash. Midway through, I don't think anybody had ever noticed this before, but I, read every news. I mean, I was the first person to ever do historical research about the Scopes trial. Nobody had ever done it before. They never did anything for Inherit the Wind. There was one book, The Great Monkey Trial, that was written by a science fiction writer, and it was science fiction. But I noticed in one of the reports by a journalist, and there were over 200 journalists from all over America and Europe covering the trial. And they all had their own accounts. They were always looking. And one of them obscurely mentioned in an article, that during, I think it was Dudley, I think it was during Dudley Field Malone's, especially, he gave a great speech during the trial. And Clarence Darrow had an ear for oratory. He was a brilliant guy and a fellow Buckeye with me. An ear for oratory. And he was hearing this speech roll over him. He listened to Brian the same way. He thought Brian was a great speaker, and he loved speaking. And apparently he was had his head back, hearing the words that Dudley Field Malone, who was also a very good speaker, flow over him. And this reporter, who, they had all the seats. No local people could fit in the courtroom. It was nothing but reporters. And he heard him say, hearing this oratory, and he was referring to the oratory. And to him, orators were gods. And he was leaning back and he just mumbled, ah. And of course, it's 110 degrees in the courtroom. Ah, it's a summer for the gods. And I read that line, and I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't even knew I remembered it. And I said, that's the title. Because gods played, I'm convinced that Darrow didn't mean gods as in religious gods. He meant he was a god. He certainly viewed himself as a god, and William Jennings Bryan viewed himself as a god. These guys were larger than life, and they knew it. And the heat, this incredible heat that they were baking through, because there was no air conditioning, there was no fan in the hall, and it was just these words, and I just said, that's it. It plays at so many levels. It plays at the religious level. It plays at the heat. It plays at the power of oratory, because I think they made this a culture war issue because of their oratory. And I think both Brian and Darrow, incredible oratory, and Dudley Field Malone and a few of the others. And so that's where the title comes from.
And what did your editor think of that, or your publisher? Did they say, nobody knows what that means? Or did they say, wow, that's got the ring of truth to it? They could have picked a more banal title, like Clash of Titans or something. But
they've always let me pick my titles because they know I'm good at it. No, I called my editor, a very, very good editor. I called my editor and immediately, perfect. They thought that was a perfect title. The only thing
it helps to have read the book.
The only thing that didn't work was the subtitle. They didn't like my subtitle.
Anything else you want to add about that book? And then we're going to go to any questions you have about the book or Ed's career in general, what a historian does. Yes, ma'am.
What was the original subtitle?
The Scopes, I'm trying to remember now. I could look, I wish I had my wall here. Oh, the Scopes trial and the meaning, something of the liberty. It was about liberty, because if you read the book, it's a lot more about the development of the idea, which did not exist. The Scopes trial was a central feature for giving us our modern concepts of liberty. It really had its roots in World War I. Think about, before World War I, we had no concept of individual liberty in America. The First Amendment didn't apply against the states. It was designed to protect the states from that. The states could ban speech, they could ban anything because it didn't apply against the states. So they could, that's why the Scopes law was upheld. And so there really wasn't a concept. The idea, America was founded on the concept of democracy, of popular rule. And that meant if a majority wants something, you can be a Democrat. Woodrow Wilson ran roughshods over individual rights in World War I. And that made people that led to the founding of the ACLU, not as a leftist group, as a protection of individual rights. And because of the Palmer raids and everything Wilson was doing. It didn't matter. The Civil War, it didn't matter the Adams and the Quasi-War. People were running roughshods over individual rights, and individual rights, civil liberties, became important. And then you had the Gitlaw case, and you have the establishment of the Bill of Rights to apply against the states during the 20s, one after one. Freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly applied against the states, so states and local governments couldn't interfere with them. But Scopes trial was part of that, and the reason why the ACLU took the case had nothing to do with religion. They wanted to make an object of a state telling science teachers how they should teach science. That's how they wanted to litigate it. It was only Clarence Darrow, when he inserted himself in the case over the objection of the ACLU, who didn't want anything to do with it. They had their team of lawyers. Their lawyer, including Charles Evan Hughes, who'd been the Republican nominee for president of the frickin' United States. He'd been on the Supreme Court. Then he was president of the ABA. And he was going to go back on the court as Chief Justice. He was going to try the case. They all quit because they wouldn't work with Darrow, because they knew he would make it a case about religion rather than about civil liberties. And I was writing the book about the rise of civil liberties in America. And if you read the book, my subtitle is much more accurate than what it is, but they were right. Their title sold better.
Conflict and drama tend to sell.
Yes.
Who else?
Thank you for the question.
Yes, sir.
And you strike me as an unusual person. You're an academic historian who sells popular books. And today, the Eric Larson, John Beecham's, Ron Chernow's all write great stuff. But do you find yourself different than the typical academics of the day in that sense?
Well, there are other academics who do write books that sell. There really are. But you do remind me of a story. McCollum, I was speaking at the, David McCollum and I were both speaking at the, and he knows my work and I of course know his. And we were both speaking at the National Book Festival, and we were in the green room talking. And finally we were having a nice conversation, and finally he leans over and says, Ed, if you want to sell books, I know your books sell 100,000 copies and my books sell 1 million copies. I think he was modest about his million. I think it was more than 1 million. If you want to sell books, give the people what they want. I says, what do they want? They want hagiography. Just write the lives of saints. Take some obscure person, like you took an obscure event. Take an obscure person, like relatively obscure person like John Adams or Truman, and only say the good things. Only say, make them into heroes. That's what people want. And I said, And I was just thinking, and he says, you're probably right, but I'm thinking in my head, I couldn't do that. And so, yeah, that's what the difference is. You're trying to believe in critical thought and try to present nuances, and you read John Adams or Truman, you're not getting that person. You're getting hagiography, and that's from the mouth of the person who writes this stuff. But he knew, he didn't do that originally when he was a true journalist, when he wrote, I don't think he did that with Brooklyn Bridge or Johnstown Flood, which are my two favorites. And he's a better writer than me. He is, McCollum was a great, but I called him, after that, I always called him America's great storyteller. But boy, can he write. I mean, he can write. But he, it's a style, and that's what, I don't think Chernow always does that. I think Hamilton's an excellent book, for example. I just think it's a superb book. John Meacham's a good friend. I really have enormous respect for every person you mentioned.
Who's from Chattanooga.
And is a professor at Vanderbilt now. Wonderful guy.
Jill Lepore was writing about this subject this week, and she was focusing on the clarity of the writing and that distinguishing. And I think as some historians have gotten terribly specialized, they adopt a more academic style, a more formal style that is going to exclude some readers who don't want to really wrestle with the book that deeply. So the good writing that you mentioned, McCollum, your book is clearly written too. It is not esoteric stuff.
Yeah.
You tell a story. Nevertheless, some topics are going to sell better than others, and the ones that endow the saints probably sell even better. But I wouldn't put yourself down either. 100,000 is not nothing.
And I do agree with you. I really want to underline, if you know what you want to say, clarity of writing, and that every person we mentioned, and I'd add Walter Isaacson to that group, they know what they want to say. And I also think that I know what I think about, spend a long time thinking about. You got to know what you want to say, and you got to say it clearly. And I agree with that. And the Meacham and McCollum, these guys are experts at this. And but as a critical thinker, my stories I'm trying to tell, and I do use narrative. I do believe very much in narrative storytelling, but it's a nuanced story I tell.
Yeah, including ambiguity.
Ambiguity, and you don't get that from, I don't think you get that too much from some writers, but you do get it from others, and I think in Hamilton you get it from Chernow. Not necessarily in his Washington book, but in his book on Hamilton, you get nuance.
John Meacham's first job was working for me at my newspaper for about 2.5 years. And there's something to that. If you spend 2.5 years where the professional ethos is getting both sides represented, then you tend to get up close to both sides, and you begin to appreciate that they are not the names they call each other necessarily. Mm-hmm. So that's something to look for in distinctions between and among historians, I think.
Well, I think the world of John Meacham, and of course, well, I've always thought the world of him, but he did write a wonderful review of my latest book in the New York Times, so I was especially appreciative when he wrote that.
Well, that's part of his hagiography. Who else? Yes, sir.
Toni Morrison once said that if there's a book that you want to read that doesn't exist yet, you must write it yourself. Does that characterize what happened with you here, or was it more that you saw a publishing opportunity?
Oh, it was the first. Absolutely. No, I didn't see a publishing opportunity at all with the Scopes trial. I found it as a fascinating study, truly as a historian. I wanted to use, I like writing and I like narrative history, but it was that I knew it was a different story, and so I was attracted to it, not as a publishing opportunity. It was the first book I used a trade press. My earlier books with academic presses, I still use academic presses for my more academic books, and I use Yale for that. But I saw this, and so I did sheepishly asked some of my colleagues I knew who published with trade presses, and I got a reference and a name, and I called Basic Books, which is the most academic of the trade books. But I did not think it would be, no. I thought people would find it interesting. I thought it'd be very much like the impact would be very much like where I started, the book about the Boston Tea Party, which never became a popular book, but historians read, and they used it. They now knew that block. When history started as an academic discipline in the 1880s, one of the references was, what we want is academic historians to each write a brick, and the bricks would become a wall, an edifice of history, and we'll create that. I think it was Rankin who said that, a German historian who was trying to build up the discipline. And it was the first PhDs in history were like 1880s. And I thought I was just writing a brick that historians would know. But I have been able to watch, much like Labrie did, I have watched every textbook of American history has to cover the Scopes trial. It just has to be there. You cannot write history, American history, without, and it's always the pivot point of the 1920s. It's what brings, because they make it tell the story of rural versus urban, north versus south. It covers too many things.
And a war still being fought.
Yeah, and so it's a pivot of the 20s, which is an interesting time. The Klan rising, because the Klan supported Bryan in this. And it's so many issues you can use that as a pivot. And I have watched that the way the Scopes trial is presented in these textbooks is entirely different. One chapter of my book, I go through the misinterpretations of the Scopes trial. It was always in textbook before. People like Hofstadter, all the superstars had of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, all of the Scopes trial in it, briefly. And it was all Inherit the Wind. It was all the fiction. And now that's not the way it's presented. So I was honestly thinking I was just creating a little block that would get a lot of attention in the history world of that period, but I never thought it would be a big seller.
Pulitzer Prizes help.
I was shocked when I got the Pulitzer Prize. Absolutely dumbfounded.
Back there?
And you think of other trials that have been seriously misrepresented or misunderstood that have some effect on our history?
That's a great question, and one I've really never thought about. I think the Zinglinger trial, was that the right name, Peter Zinglinger? The press trial from 17 whatever. That one is very misrepresented. I'm trying to think of some others. The Burr, Aaron Burr, the Burr trials. It's a good question. I'd have to sit here, because I don't think O.J. Simpson is particularly wrongly presented. Leopold Lowe became legendary, but it's not too far off. Compulsion pretty well captures it, the novel and the play, the movie. So I would, let me think about that and try to come up with...
You can think about it, and I think that'd at least make another article, if not a book.
I think it's a good question, and we'll see if the Trump trials get misrepresented.
That's the question I have. The Trump trial, well, how do you think that'll play in history?
I think it depends. First let me say, I'm a historian, not a prophet. But I do agree that, as several commentators have said, including Trump himself, that the ultimate verdict on Trump will be in November. And I think that how that plays out will profoundly affect how the trial is viewed in history. What happens if Trump loses? It'll be viewed as one way. It'll be a drop in the bucket, a drop, like that made the bucket run over, the old French saying. I used to be able to say it in French, the drop that makes the bucket run over. It'll be viewed that way. If Trump wins, it'll be viewed a very different way. So I do think how it's perceived is the verdict's going to be in November.
And there's always the risk somebody might make a movie out of it.
Boy,
and then you can write a corrective of that.
Boy, that would be a boring movie. Gosh.
Yes, sir, right there.
You
talked about the civil liberties issue here, but clearly the Tennessee law was written with evangelical Christianity, or you call Christian nationalism, in mind. I wonder if you have an insight into the mindset of people who adopt things that are, from the point of view of a scientist or a physician, completely untrue and so obvious. And this goes to the flat earthers, and the people who still think that NASA faked the moon landings. It's not always a religious issue, that I can see, at least not straightforward religious issue. Did reading and writing this and researching it give you an insight into that sort of mindset?
Well, you can take your question in a variety of different ways. How much, and this is true, I think, today, how much is it anti-science, and how much, or stuff we'll stuff these experts. The part of Trump that appeals to people not because they agree with him, but they just want to stick it to the experts, or they want to stick it to Williams College, or they want to stick it to Harvard, or they want to stick it to the scientist. And that's part of the appeal in a cultural battle. And so lots of people who did not care about the religious issue per se just like to stick it to the scientist, and that had increased because scientific skepticism had exploded with World War I. That was known as the chemist's war back then. And the vulgarity, the use of, Germany had been the scientific leader. And of course, Americans pilloried Germany. And the chemical weapons and the other weapons that were developed, sonar and other weapons that were developed during the First World War, created a backlash against science. And they were intentionally, and of course the Bolsheviks had taken power in Russia, claiming to be scientific. They claimed that they were the government of science back then. It's hard to remember them that way, but that's what they were viewed at. And so, and there was a bit of anti-Semitism in the anti-science back then, just like there was later. So all those things played into it. So part of it was, I do think, and of course, Brian, master of that, if you read his original text, all his speeches, he always talk about, let's take it to the scientific Soviet that is trying to cram their evil theories down our throats. The scientific Soviet, that was the phrase he used. He hits both buttons. So I do think there was an anti-science element to it, just like there was in addition, which is sort of I think partly what you're asking. And I think it's playing off that. So it was not just religion, just like personally, I don't think all these states are passing laws against abortion. I think some of that's pro-life, but I think there are other factors at play in the passage of those laws. And the same way of the attacks against the restrictions during COVID. I think there's lots of things at play at those. And if you listen to the speakers closely, you can hear, and listen to President Trump, you can hear these hot buttons being hurt. Not hard enough that they can't deny them later. Oh no, I never said that. I never said lock her up. I never said that. I just sort of smiled when others did. And so I think they can play on those issues, and I think that was happening then. It wasn't all, I totally agree, it wasn't all about religion, just like I don't think the anti-abortion movement today is all about religion.
In a fairly rationalistic community like Williams College, history is regarded, the examination and the research is almost like the scientific method. There are certain standards that the rationalistic group adheres to. That's not what the religious fundamentalists or fundamentalists in other areas adhere to. They adhere to faith. And those are two radically different standards. And if you, one of the problems now is that people are separating even by where they live. So you don't, if you're a rational scientist, you don't probably live next door to a Southern Baptist preacher. And the more you separate that, the more you tend to divide yourself into those camps and regard the other side as the enemy. They are different. I certainly believe more in the scientific method myself, but that faith community, you can't just argue against them on the basis of evidence and scientifically provable facts and things like that. That's not where they're coming from. We've got time for one more question. Did I see a hand? No, that's a hand holding up a chin back there. Yeah, right there.
Thank you very much for being here. So Ed, does your book play a part, and if it doesn't, should, and where, in today's college curriculum?
I think it's still used all over. I constantly run even into law students, say, oh, I was assigned your book in college. Never read it, but I was assigned it. And it was just picked. I just got picked to be universal curriculum in Texas. There you go. Or just got notice. I think it's a one-year thing. They rotate the books through. So yeah, I think it's still that and Magnificent Catastrophe, and of course my best-selling book ever, Evolution: The Remarkable History of Scientific Theory. that sold more than all the others because it's more used for college. They still get. I think it's assigned, and I think it's almost inevitable. It's almost a requirement on anybody getting a PhD in American history. It's one of the lists, they have a sort of the corpus if you're studying to be an American historian. It has none of my other books, that's the Summer for the Gods, that's like on the corpus. So yeah, it keeps bubbling along. Again, I thought it was a one-shot deal that was been like the Tea Party, but it turns out to be, it's the gift that keeps giving. And next year is the 100th anniversary, and I almost have to, I wish I had a secretary. I'm going, I'll be in his state 4 times, also all over the country, but 4 times just in his
Old
state.
times there, not forgotten.
They bring me back. Even Dayton, Chattanooga, Nashville, and Knoxville, all separate deals. So yeah, it'll next year.
Okay, last night I cooked dinner for Ed. Tonight he's going to be with you, and in the next couple of days. So if you have further questions that occur to you, gather him by the scruff of the neck and ask him. Meanwhile, thank you so much.
Let's thank Paul Neely and Ed Larson.